In August 1991, tanks rolled through Moscow for 72 hours. When they left, the Soviet Union was gone, but the city would stay frozen in 1991 for the next 10 years. To the outside observer, the USSR appeared monolithic, a geopolitical constant that had defined the 20th century. But on the morning of August 19th, the ground began to shake in the outskirts of Moscow. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a low-frequency mechanical roar that grew louder with every passing second. At 9 a.m., the elite Tamanskaya Tank Division and the Kantemirovskaya Guards Motor Rifle Division crossed the city limits. Columns of T-80UD main battle tanks and BMP armored personnel carriers ground down the asphalt of Leninsky Prospect and Fairskaya Street. These were the instruments of total war, usually reserved for the plains of Germany or the mountains of Afghanistan, now occupying the intersections of the Soviet capital. The smell of diesel exhaust replaced the summer air. The sheer visual impact was profound, but the auditory experience was terrifying. Most Muscovites did not learn about the invasion from their windows. They learned about it from the silence. On that Monday morning, millions of citizens turned on their televisions to find that all regular programming had been suspended. There was no news, there were no cartoons, there were no morning exercise routines. In its place, on every single channel was a looped broadcast of Tchaikovsky's Swan Lake. In the Soviet semiotic tradition, the broadcasting of classical music, particularly this specific ballet, was the code for a state funeral or a leadership crisis. Between the acts of the ballet, a somber news anchor read a declaration from a group calling themselves the State Committee on the State of Emergency, or GKCHP. They announced that President Mikhail Gorbachev had stepped down due to ill health and that they had assumed control to save the country from chaos and anarchy. The sheer surrealism of the broadcast set the tone for the next 3 days. Ballerinas dancing in perfect unison while the Constitution was being dismantled.
But this was not a sudden accident. The machinery of this coup had begun turning 24 hours earlier in the humid heat of the Crimea. On the afternoon of Sunday, August 18th, Mikhail Gorbachev was vacationing at his state dacha in Foros, 1,300 kilometers south of Moscow. He was swimming in the Black Sea, unaware that his own security apparatus was tightening a noose around the property. At 4:50 p.m., a delegation of high-ranking officials arrived unannounced at the gates. The group included Oleg Baklanov, the first deputy chairman of the Defense Council, Valery Boldin, Gorbachev's own chief of staff, and General Valentin Varenikov, the commander of ground forces. They didn't come to talk. They came with a binary demand: declare a state of emergency to halt the signing of the upcoming Union Treaty or resign in favor of Vice President Gennady Yanayev. Gorbachev refused. He reportedly dismissed them as adventurists and suicides, but his defiance was irrelevant because the trap had already been sprung. Before the delegation even entered the dacha, the KGB, under the direction of Chairman Vladimir Khrushchev, had severed all lines of communication. The phones went dead. The strategic lines to Moscow were cut. The nuclear briefcase, the ultimate symbol of Soviet power, was confiscated. The president of the USSR was effectively placed under house arrest in his own vacation home, removed from the board 1,300 kilometers from the capital. The decapitation strike was complete. The catalyst for this desperate gamble was a piece of paper. The impending signing of the new Union Treaty was scheduled for August 20th, 1991. Championed by Gorbachev, this document proposed a radical decentralization of the USSR, effectively transforming the unitary totalitarian state into a loose confederation of sovereign republics. For the hardliners within the Communist Party, the military, and the KGB, this treaty was not reform, it was the death warrant of the Soviet superpower. They believed that by removing Gorbachev, they could freeze time. They believed they could stop the centrifugal forces of glasnost that were pulling the empire apart. They were wrong. The coup d'etat of August 1991 would become the empire's final desperate convulsion, a reactionary attempt to freeze time that paradoxically accelerated the country's dissolution. Back in Moscow, the conspirators formalized their power grab. They called themselves the Gang of Eight. This was not a cabal of young, energetic revolutionaries. These were the gray cardinals of the Soviet establishment, men like Dmitry Yazov, the Minister of Defense, and Boris Pugo, the Minister of Internal Affairs. They controlled the levers of coercion, but lacked the political imagination to use them effectively. They spent the night of August 18 to 19 at the Kremlin, reportedly drinking heavily as they drafted Decree No. 1. This document suspended political parties, banned opposition newspapers, and established a curfew. They operated under the fatal assumption that the Soviet people, exhausted by economic stagnation and shortages, would welcome the return of the Iron Hand. They failed to realize that the country they were trying to save no longer existed. The structures of power had been hollowed out. The deployment of the tanks on the morning of the 19th revealed immediate cracks in the coup's execution. The soldiers sitting atop the T-80s were not hardened ideological warriors. They were largely conscripts, some as young as 18 or 19. Interviews conducted by foreign attachés and brave journalists on the street revealed profound confusion among the ranks. When asked why they were there, soldiers gave vague answers about protecting the constitutional order, or simply admitted that they didn't know. They said they were ordered to move, so they moved. The tanks stopped at red lights. The commanders lacked maps of the city. The terrifying occupation force was, in reality, a lost and confused group of young men sitting on top of terrifying machinery. While the GKCHP commanded elite armored divisions like the Temenskaya and Kantemirskaya, the morale was non-existent. This disconnect between the hardware and the human element would define the next 72 hours. The plotters had secured the Kremlin, the TV tower, and the news agencies, but they made a catastrophic tactical error in the opening moves of the game. They failed to arrest the one man who could rally the opposition. Boris Yeltsin, the newly elected president of the Russian SFSR, was at his dacha when the coup began. The KGB Alpha Group had him under surveillance, but the order to detain him never came. Realizing the danger, Yeltsin raced to the White House, the seat of the Russian parliament on the Krasnopreznenskaya embankment. This building would become the magnetic north for the resistance. By the afternoon of August 19, the abstraction of the television broadcast was shattered by the physical reality of the street. Thousands of Muscovites began to gather around the White House. They defied the rain. They defied the fear of a crackdown. They began to erect makeshift barricades using whatever was available: commandeered trolleybuses, construction-reinforced concrete, park benches, and iron fencing. The city was splitting into two centers of power. On one side was the Kremlin, representing the past, the hardliners, and the tanks. On the other side was the White House, representing the future and the resistance. The coup leaders had the guns, but they had lost the narrative before the first shot was fired. They had underestimated the psychological shift that had occurred during the years of perestroika. They assumed fear would paralyze the population. Instead, it galvanized them. And at 1 p.m., a moment of supreme political theater occurred that would signal to the entire world that the coup was not a fait accompli. Boris Yeltsin exited the White House. He didn't run, he walked straight toward the line of armor surrounding the building. He climbed atop tank number 110 of the Tamanskaya division. This was a tank whose crew had refused to take hostile action against the civilians. Standing on the hull of the machine sent to crush him, shaking the hand of the tank commander, Yeltsin read his appeal to the citizens of Russia. He denounced the coup as reactionary and unconstitutional. He called for a general strike. The image of Yeltsin on the tank was captured by Western media and beamed around the world. Domestically, despite the censorship, the image circulated via flyers and word of mouth. It was the visual proof that the monolith had cracked. As the sun began to set on the first day, the atmosphere in Moscow shifted from confusion to a strange, tense standoff. The tanks were parked, the people were gathering, and the leaders of the coup were about to step in front of the cameras to explain themselves. They intended to project strength and stability. Instead, they were about to provide the world with the most damning evidence of their own weakness.
The press conference scheduled for 5 p.m. would go down in history not for what was said, but for what was seen. If the morning belonged to the tanks, the evening belonged to the television cameras. At 5 p.m. on August 19, the coup leaders attempted to legitimize their authority by holding a press conference at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Press Center. They expected a compliant audience. They expected to project the image of steady hands guiding the ship of state. Instead, they delivered a public relations disaster of historic proportions. Gennady Yanayev, the acting president, took the stage. He sat under the glare of the studio lights, attempting to explain why the democratically elected leader of the country was suddenly missing. He claimed the country had become ungovernable. He repeated the lie that Gorbachev was resting and very tired. But as he spoke, his physical demeanor betrayed the entire operation. His hands shook uncontrollably. It wasn't a subtle twitch, it was a tremor so violent and persistent that it was clearly visible even on the low-fidelity cathode ray screens of Soviet televisions. To a Soviet populace highly attuned to reading the nonverbal cues of their leadership, a survival skill honed over 70 years of propaganda, Yanayev's trembling hands didn't signal strength. They screamed of weakness, guilt, and fear. The spell of terror that the tanks had cast in the morning was broken by the onset of ridicule in the evening. The atmosphere in the room shifted from deferential to combative. Then came the question that would shatter the junta's facade. Tatiana Malkina, a young journalist from the independent Nezavisimaya Gazeta, stood up. She didn't ask about the treaty. She didn't ask about the economy. She looked directly at the self-proclaimed president and asked, "Tell me, please, do you understand that you carried out a coup d'etat tonight?" The room went silent. The plotters appeared like schoolboys caught in a transgression. The broadcast, intended to show resolve, instead revealed a junta that was drunk, scared, and improvising. While the leadership was crumbling on live TV, the situation on the streets was hardening into a siege. By Tuesday, August 20, the crowd around the White House had swelled to tens of thousands. It was a perfect cross-section of Soviet society, a demographic mix that the Communist Party claimed to represent but had long since alienated. You had Afghan war veterans standing shoulder to shoulder with university students. You had intellectuals building barricades alongside factory workers. Orthodox priests moved through the rain-slicked crowds, distributing Bibles to the soldiers sitting on the tanks. A living chain of defenders linked arms around the Parliament building. They weren't just standing there, they were fortifying. The barricades grew taller, constructed from a chaotic scavenge of the city's infrastructure, reinforcing bars, park benches, and overturned vehicles. But while the physical resistance was building walls of concrete, a digital resistance was forming in the ether, something the gray cardinals in the Kremlin didn't even know existed. Here is what they didn't tell you about 1991. The coup plotters knew how to control television, radio, and newspapers. They knew how to jam frequencies and seize printing presses. But they had absolutely no concept of the internet. In August 1991, the Relcom computer network, the first Soviet internet provider, became a critical lifeline. While the KGB was cutting phone lines to the Crimea, programmers in Moscow were logging onto Usenet newsgroups. Specifically, on talk.politics.soviet, they began disseminating eyewitness accounts, Yeltsin's decrees, and news from the White House to the rest of the world. This was the first time in history that the internet played a pivotal role in resisting a coup d'etat. The Iron Curtain of information was being bypassed by a 9600 baud modem. While the plotters thought they had successfully isolated Moscow, the entire world was reading real-time updates from the barricades. The GKCHP responded to this growing defiance with escalation. They declared a curfew in Moscow from 11 p.m. to 5 a.m. General Nikolai Kalinin was appointed military commandant of the city. The streets emptied of casual pedestrians, leaving only the soldiers and the die-hard defenders. The air grew heavy with the anticipation of violence. Rumors began to proliferate that Operation Thunder was imminent. This was the code name for a coordinated assault by the KGB's elite Alpha Group and Vinepol Special Forces.
The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Use the tanks to breach the barricades, send in the special forces to clear the building, and liquidate the leadership of the Russian Federation. But inside the security apparatus, the machine was jamming. The Gang of Eight issued the orders, but the transmission belts of power, the mid-level officers and elite commanders, had snapped. The commanders of the Alpha Group, specifically General Viktor Karpukhin, hesitated. They had conducted reconnaissance on the White House and came to a horrifying conclusion. The building was surrounded by thousands of civilians acting as human shields. Any assault would not be a surgical operation, it would be a massacre. Reconnaissance reports estimated that storming the White House would result in thousands of civilian casualties. The elite officers of the KGB, men trained to kill without hesitation, looked at the order and then looked at the crowd. "We will not shoot our own people," became the whispered consensus among the special forces. The coup leaders were pushing buttons that were no longer connected to anything.
However, the civilians on the ground didn't know about this hesitation. To them, the threat was absolute. As night fell on August 20, the tension at the intersection of the Garden Ring and Novi Arbat reached a breaking point. The defenders were exhausted, wet, and terrified. Every shadow looked like a Spetsnaz soldier. Every mechanical noise sounded like an approaching T-80. And then, shortly after midnight, the noise became real. A column of BMP infantry fighting vehicles from the Taman division began to move. They were maneuvering through a tunnel on the guarding ring, Sadovoe Koltso. In reality, these troops were likely just patrolling to enforce the curfew. They weren't launching the assault on the White House. But in the fog of war, intention doesn't matter. Perception does. The nerves of the defenders were frayed. Believing that this was the start of Operation Thunder, protesters rushed to block the tunnel entrance with trolley buses. The column drove into a trap. The lead vehicles found their path blocked. The soldiers, sealed inside their armored shells, were suddenly surrounded by an angry, shouting mob throwing stones and Molotov cocktails. They were young conscripts, blinded by the darkness and the narrow confines of the tunnel. Panic set in. What followed was a chaotic skirmish, illuminated only by the harsh glare of flares and the muzzle flashes of warning shots. It was a tragic misunderstanding that would produce the only combat fatalities of the coup in Moscow. 3 young men, Dmitry Komar, Vladimir Usov, and Ilya Krychevsky, charged the armored vehicles. They weren't fighting for territory, they were fighting for the idea that the tanks had to stop. Dmitry Komar, a 22-year-old Afghan war veteran, attempted to jump onto a moving BMP, number 536. He tried to cover its viewing slit with a tarp to blind the driver. It was a suicidal act of bravery. The maneuvering vehicle threw him off. He was crushed by the tracks or killed by the impact against the tunnel wall. Seeing Komar fall, Vladimir Usov, a 37-year-old businessman, rushed to help him. In the chaos, he was struck by a ricocheting bullet or shrapnel. Finally, Ilya Krychevsky, a 28-year-old architect and amateur poet, was shot in the head while standing in the roadway as soldiers opened their hatches and fired warning shots into the crowd. 3 bodies lay on the asphalt of the Garden Ring. The bloodbath that everyone feared had finally begun. But instead of triggering a civil war, these 3 deaths did something completely unexpected. They shocked both sides into paralysis. The deaths of Dmitry Komar, Vladimir Usov, and Ilya Krychevsky in the tunnel were tragic, but they were also decisive. The bloodbath that everyone feared had begun, and the reaction from the coup leaders was not to escalate, but to recoil. Defense Minister Dmitry Yazov, an old soldier who had spent his life preparing for war with NATO, was reportedly horrified by the spilling of Russian blood on the streets of Moscow. He looked at the reports from the Garden Ring and drained the last reserves of his resolve. He ordered the troops to halt and eventually withdraw. The morning of August 21 brought a stunned silence to the capital. Muscovites woke up expecting an airstrike or a final assault. Instead, they heard the grinding of gears shifting into reverse.
The engines of the tanks idled, the turrets turned away from the White House, and the columns began to retreat. The coup had collapsed. It hadn't been defeated by a superior military force. It had been defeated by its own moral bankruptcy and the refusal of the people to be afraid. On August 22, a Tu-134 plane brought Mikhail Gorbachev back from his isolation in Foros. He stepped onto the tarmac at Vnukovo II airport wearing a casual windbreaker, looking disoriented and exhausted. He was free, but the country he returned to was no longer the one he had led just days prior. Gorbachev made a fatal miscalculation in those first hours of freedom. He mistakenly believed he could return to the Kremlin and reform the Communist Party, picking up exactly where he left off. He did not realize that power had shifted entirely to the man who had stood on the tank. The humiliation was broadcast live. In a session of the Russian Supreme Soviet on August 23, Boris Yeltsin forced Gorbachev to the podium. With the cameras rolling, Yeltsin aggressively signed a document suspending the activities of the Russian Communist Party. He then literally forced Gorbachev to read it. The General Secretary, the most powerful man in the Eastern Bloc, was publicly dismantled by his subordinate. It was a brutal piece of political theater that signaled the end of the Soviet experiment.
That same evening, the emotional climax of the revolution occurred at Lubyanka Square, the headquarters of the KGB. For decades, this building had been the epicenter of state terror, the place where dossiers were compiled and execution orders were signed. Standing in front of it was an 11-ton iron statue of Felix Dzerzhinsky, the founder of the Soviet secret police. This statue was the visual anchor of the system's intimidation. A massive crowd gathered. They were angry, euphoric, and fearless. Demonstrators initially tried to topple Iron Felix by hand, looping ropes around the statue, but it was too heavy. Eventually, cranes were brought in. Under the glare of floodlights, the iron figure was hoisted into the air, dangling by a noose of steel cables against the night sky. As the statue was lowered onto a flatbed truck, the symbol of 70 years of repression was physically removed from the heart of Moscow. It was the visual punctuation mark of the Soviet century, a moment of pure catharsis. But here is what the history books often gloss over. They treat the toppling of the statue as the happy ending. The dragon was slain, the wall was down, and freedom had arrived. But for the people of Moscow, the euphoria lasted only a moment. The statue was gone, but the vacuum it left behind was about to be filled by something far more volatile. The Soviet Union lingered on life support for 4 more months. One by one, the republics declared independence. The final blow came on December 8th, when the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus met in a hunting lodge in the Belovezha forest. In a secret ceremony, they signed an accord declaring that the USSR, as a subject of international law and a geopolitical reality, ceases to exist. It was a geopolitical autopsy performed on a living patient. On December 25, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev resigned. At 7:32 p.m., the red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin flagpole for the last time. It was replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Soviet Union was gone. The Cold War was over. The West had won. But this is where our story truly begins. The script's premise is that the city stayed frozen in 1991 for the next 10 years. This isn't just a metaphor. While the political maps changed overnight, the physical and economic reality of Moscow entered a strange purgatorial stasis. The 1990s in Moscow were a time of suspended animation, where the debris of the Soviet collapse remained unburied, coexisting with the violent birth of capitalism. The new government, led by Yeltsin, had no time for gradual transition. They chose a method known as shock therapy. On January 2, 1992, President Yeltsin and his economic architect, Yegor Gaidar, liberalized prices that had been fixed by the state for decades. The theory was that the market would naturally correct itself. The reality was a bomb going off in the wallet of every Soviet citizen. Inflation did not just rise, it exploded. The liberalization triggered a hyperinflationary spiral that peaked at approximately 2,600% in 1992. Imagine waking up to find that the money you had saved for 20 years to buy a car could now only buy a pair of boots. A week later, it could only buy a loaf of bread. The generational wealth of the Soviet middle class, the savings for dachas, for retirement, for children, was effectively vaporized in a matter of weeks. The city of Moscow, once the showcase of socialist achievement, transformed into a giant open-air bazaar. The proud avenues like Tverskaya and Leninsky Prospect, where the tanks had rolled just months before, were now lined with desperate people. It wasn't a market in the traditional sense. It was a garage sale of a collapsing civilization. Professors, engineers, and doctors stood in the freezing cold, selling their personal belongings to survive. You would see an elderly woman holding a single crystal vase, a veteran selling his medals, a teenager selling a pair of imported shoes. Bottles of vodka became a more stable currency than the ruble. The kiosk, or laryok, became the primary architectural unit of this new economy. These weren't shops, they were metal boxes that sprang up on every corner, often operating 24/7. Through a tiny window, you could buy a chaotic mix of goods that defined the era: Snickers bars, bootleg liquor, and imported pornography. This was the freedom that had been promised. It was a freedom to starve, a freedom to sell your history for a meal. The state had withdrawn from the economy, but it had also withdrawn from the concept of order. The police, underfunded and demoralized, simply stopped functioning. And in the shadows of those metal kiosks, a new power was rising. If the state wouldn't regulate the market, someone else would. The wild 90s were about to earn their name. The vacuum of authority left by the KGB was instantly filled by the Bratva, the Brotherhood. The collapse of the Soviet Union didn't just unleash democracy, it unleashed the most violent criminal turf war in modern history. The frozen city was about to catch fire. If the state was frozen, organized crime was hyperactive. The kiosks that lined the streets needed protection, and the police were too busy trying to feed their own families to provide it. Into this void stepped the Bratva. In the 1990s, Moscow became the battleground for violent turf wars between rival clans that operated with the discipline of armies and the brutality of butchers. The most notorious among them were the Orakhovskaya, hailing from the grim tower blocks of the south, and the Saltsevskaya, which would grow into one of the most powerful criminal organizations in the world. This wasn't the romanticized mafia of Hollywood. This was raw, industrial violence. The violence was not hidden, it was performative. It was designed to be seen. If you owned a business in Moscow in 1994, you paid a krisha, literally a roof, for protection. If you didn't, your kiosk burned down. If you still refused, you disappeared. Contract killings became a commonplace method of dispute resolution, a grim substitute for a court system that had ceased to function. In 1995 alone, over a dozen high-ranking bankers were assassinated in Moscow. These weren't back-alley stabbings, they were daylight hits with automatic weapons and car bombs in the city center. The city felt dangerous, dark, and lawless. But amidst this carnage, a new and bizarre social class emerged, the New Russian, Novi Ruski. You could spot them instantly against the gray backdrop of the crumbling city. They wore the uniform of the era, a raspberry-colored sport coat, malinovi pidjak, heavy gold chains, and they drove the ultimate symbol of status, the Mercedes 600. They were surrounded by bodyguards, symbolizing gaudy, violent wealth amidst general poverty. The visual contrast was nauseating. On one side of Tverskaya Street, you had a grandmother selling her wedding ring to buy milk. On the other side, a 25-year-old gangster was stepping out of a blast-proof limousine to drop $1,000 at a casino. The social contract hadn't just been broken, it had been shredded. But the economy wasn't just run by gangsters, it was kept alive by the shuttlers, chelmuki. These were the engine of the consumer economy. Teachers, engineers, and scientists who had lost their salaries became international mules. They traveled to Turkey, China, or Poland, filling massive checkered nylon bags with cheap jeans, leather jackets, and electronics, and hauling them back to Moscow to sell at the open-air markets. If you wore a pair of jeans in Moscow in 1996, they weren't imported by a corporation. They were likely carried on the back of a physics professor who had taken a bus to Istanbul. This survivalism created a strange paralysis in the city's physical form. The metaphor of a frozen city was literally visible in Moscow's skyline. As funding for state projects evaporated overnight, massive Soviet construction sites were simply abandoned. They were left to rot as skeletal reminders of a dead empire, suspended in time. Take the Kovrina Hospital in northern Moscow. Construction began in 1980, intended to be a state-of-the-art medical facility, but in 1992, the cranes stopped moving. For the next 3 decades, this massive, brutalist structure stood as a waterlogged, decaying ruin. It didn't get finished, it didn't get demolished, it just sat there, frozen. It became a legendary site for urban explorers and the subject of dark urban legends involving satanic cults and murders, a concrete ghost haunting the district until its eventual demolition in 2018. Then there was the Hotel Rossiya, once the largest hotel in the world, occupying prime real estate right next to the Kremlin. It fell into disrepair throughout the 90s. It was too expensive to fix and too big to ignore, so it became a symbol of the stagnation, a rotting tooth in the mouth of the city. For 10 years, Moscow was a patchwork of the past and the future, but the present was missing. You walked past buildings that were half-finished and buildings that were falling down. The neon signs of casinos illuminated potholes that could swallow a car. The Bolshoi Theater still performed world-class ballet, but the metro stations beneath it were filled with homeless children. This was the suspended animation of the 1990s. The debris of socialism remained unburied, coexisting with the violent birth of market capitalism. It was a time of survival, where the grand narratives of empire, the space race, the global revolution, the military superpower were replaced by the daily struggle for bread, safety, and stability. The ideology of the state was replaced by the ideology of the dollar. And in this chaos, the people of Moscow developed a unique psychological armor. They learned to trust no one. They learned that the government would not save them. They learned that the only thing that mattered was what you could hold in your hands and defend with your life. The coup of August 1991 was supposed to save the Soviet Union. Instead, it broke the dam. The 72 hours of tanks on the streets were just the opening act for a decade of trauma. The plotters thought they were fighting for the preservation of a political system. They didn't realize they were opening the door to a decade of anarchy. For 10 years, Moscow was a patchwork of the past and the future, but the present was missing. It was a city of ghosts, where the skeletons of Soviet ambition, like the waterlogged Kovrino Hospital and the rotting Hotel Rossiya, stood as monuments to a civilization that had simply stopped breathing. But eventually, the thaw had to come, and when it didn't come with the gentle warmth of spring. It came with the ruthless efficiency of the wrecking ball. The physical scars of the frozen decade were eventually erased. The Kovrino Hospital, after decades of attracting urban explorers and fueling dark legends, was finally demolished in 2018. The Hotel Rossiya, the gargantuan symbol of Soviet hospitality that had become a sore on the face of the Kremlin, was wiped from the map in the 2000s to make way for Zaryadye Park. The visible reminders of the stagnation were pulverized into dust and carted away, but the psychological tracks left by the tanks of August 1991 were not so easily paved over. The events of those 72 hours were not merely the end of a political system, they were the trauma ward of a new nation. The coup plotters, in their incompetence, did not save the Union, they accelerated its disintegration. By trying to freeze time, they shattered the clock, and the frozen decade that followed was the price that people paid for that transition. Consider the fate of the men who started it all. The Gang of Eight, the gray cardinals who thought they could turn back history, met ends that were as pathetic as their coup. Boris Pugo, the Minister of Internal Affairs, realized the game was up immediately. On August 22, 1991, as the arrest warrant was being signed, he committed suicide. The others, Yanayev, Khrushchev, Yazov, were arrested. They spent time in prison, but they weren't executed. They were eventually amnestied. They drifted into obscurity, dying as pensioners in a country they no longer recognized. Yanayev, the man with the trembling hands, died in 2010. Yazov, the man who ordered the tanks into Moscow but refused to order the slaughter, lived until 2020, a relic of a vanished army. But the true legacy of August 1991 isn't found in the biographies of the plotters. It is found in the memory of the streets. The Garden Ring Tunnel, where 3 young men died, became a sacred geography for a brief moment. Dmitry Komar, Vladimir Usov, and Ilya Khrushchevsky were the only combat fatalities of the coup in Moscow. Their deaths shocked both sides into paralysis and prevented a civil war. They were the blood sacrifice that allowed the Soviet Union to die peacefully.
Yet the promise of that moment, the promise of the living chain around the White House, the promise of the students and the soldiers standing together, was betrayed by the reality of the 1990s. The euphoria of toppling the statue of Jasinski at Lubyanka Square disguised the turbulent vacuum that was about to open. The people wanted freedom. What they got was the wild 90s. They got hyperinflation that vaporized their savings. They got gang wars that turned their streets into shooting galleries. They got a government that was as frozen and paralyzed as the construction sites that littered the skyline. The city of Moscow, caught between the hammer of Soviet stagnation and the anvil of wild capitalism, bore the scars of this history. The cynicism that defines much of modern Russian politics was born in the queues and the kiosks of that frozen decade. The distrust of authority, the reliance on personal networks, the resilience of the survivor. These were the lessons learned in the wreckage left behind when the tanks withdrew. To the outside observer, the USSR appeared monolithic right up until the moment it wasn't. It seemed eternal. But internally, it had been hollowed out long before the first T-80 rolled down Leninsky Prospect. The coup was just the final, desperate convulsion. It was the moment the illusion finally broke, and the reality of the collapse rushed in to fill the void. For 72 hours in August 1991, the world held its breath. We watched a superpower teeter on the edge of the abyss. We watched a trembling hand on a podium betray the weakness of a totalitarian state. We watched a president stand on a tank and defy an empire. And we watched a civilization exhale for the last time. The tanks left, the statue fell, the flag came down, but the city stayed frozen, caught in the amber of history, waiting 10 years to start living again. And if you look closely at the asphalt of the Garden Ring or the empty spaces where the statues used to stand, you can still see the shadow of those 3 days. It is a story of 3 young men dead in a tunnel, a trembling hand on a podium, and a city that had to die before it could be reborn.